This podcast is general in nature and hasn't taken your circumstances into account. It's important you consider your personal circumstances and speak to a financial advisor before deciding what's right for you. Any general tax information provided is provided as a guide only. Now, here's Shane and Deanna.
G'day everybody. Hi Deanna.
Hi Shane.
So, rather eventful week over the last week. Lots of focus on the US election with the Republican National Convention. J.D. Vance. Now we've got Kamala Harris replacing Biden, which is at least the nominee. Of course, that's yet to be formally confirmed, but looks like it probably will be. So how does this all impact markets?
Well, a week ago we thought that the Democrat nominee would be completely different to what we have this week. Share markets, I mean, they've gone higher in the past week, but I think it's hard to understand if any of this election volatility is actually driving that. I mean, some people were saying that there was a bit of this Trump trade after the attempted assassination. We saw some tech shares started increasing at the same time that Trump's probability of becoming the president was rising. And some are pointing to the increase in tech shares in the past few days as another sign of this Trump trade. But I think you can sort of see it as some improvement in tech stocks after we had some concerns about a potential tariff from the Democrats last week. So I'm not really too sure what's in this for markets. Markets don't like uncertainty. And we've seen the VIX or the volatility index rise in the past few weeks. So that's definitely reflected in this election uncertainty. Okay, so now that we have Kamala Harris as the nominee for the Democrats, we've seen that the polls have actually narrowed between Trump and Harris, and they've basically gone back to the same place where they were before the first debate.
Same with the betting markets, isn't
and
it?
the betting markets as well, yeah. So Trump is still ahead by about 2 percentage points in the polls, and there's about a 55% probability that he will be the president in November.
So it just looks a bit more competitive than it was
prior
to Biden.
It looks like a much closer election now, and I think as the next few weeks go and as they poll more people and as we get some more results across the states, especially those battleground states, then we'll see, I guess, some more signs as to how people are thinking that Harris will go.
In some ways, it's kind of hard for Harris because her boss is still in the presidency. So he's still on the sidelines.
He's still in charge, yeah.
Till the end of the year. He's still in charge of things. In some ways, it'd be easier if he just stepped down and she took over as his replacement from now. And then voters would have to decide to get rid of her as president, as opposed to now, where you've got a situation where they have to vote her in. So it's a slightly different hurdle. I must admit, I get confused about the Trump trade. I think it is quite clear that multinationals would probably be losers under Trump in the event of a trade war, whereas US small caps would probably benefit more.
And we've actually seen that in the markets. The Russell 2000 has been increasing or has been outperforming the S&P. Do you think that there's something in that?
Well, it could well be. I mean, there was an argument that it was all because there's now more confidence that the Fed's going to cut interest rates. That pushed up the Russell 2000. But it could be because investors are saying, well, if Trump wins, then small caps, Russell 2000 type stocks would probably do better relative to large multinationals that might get caught up in a trade war. I guess you could also argue quite clearly that fossil fuel companies, oil, gas, drill, baby drill, all that sort of stuff, they'll benefit under Trump relative to say renewable stocks. But in terms of the overall market, you can make an argument that the volatility we've seen in shares globally and in Australia the last few weeks was just because they got to record highs, they got overbought. Investors said, well, maybe take some profits. We're coming into the August-September period. It's often a bit softer through that time. So maybe that just explains what's happened as opposed to all this obsession with Trump. So it's a bit hard to tell. The other thing, of course, coming up is the US earnings reporting season. We have seen in the last few reporting seasons in the US that it starts off with the market expecting something like 7% earnings growth. It turns out to be 10%. And maybe the market's saying, well, you know, we're now coming into that. Companies will start surprising on the upside again, and that will be perhaps the next big driver, at least for the next few weeks.
And do you think that Harris's policies are any different really to Biden? I mean, all we really know about her history was that she was a prosecutor and she sounds, tough on crime. But besides that, I don't really see any differences in her policies relative to Biden. And if we're thinking about how potentially her as the president could influence companies.
It's odd in a way that she was a prosecutor and they will say he's a felon. So it's a prosecutor versus a felon. But anyway, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I can't see any major differences in policies. In many ways, they seem very similar to what Biden had. She is from California. California is known to be a fairly progressive state, which could work against her. Particularly in terms of identity politics and those sorts of things. But I suspect she'll just do the same sort of thing that Biden did. I think Biden's been okay. The main gripe I would have with them was that they just spent too much money in the first year, in 2021. They injected $2 trillion into the US economy, which arguably added to the inflation problem at the time. And you could also argue that they've made it easier for the Republicans by letting people across the southern border. And of course, they should have done a bit of a U-turn like the Rudd government in Australia did many years ago when they did the same thing and they had to then adopt the same policies that the coalition had and get a bit tougher on the borders. But yeah, I don't see a huge policy difference there between Harris and Biden.
Although that supply of workers, you could argue, has also been propping up the US labor market and putting. And if you don't get that inflow of those workers, you might see higher wages growth or even some sort of a higher unemployment rate as well.
That's right. Yeah, the swings and roundabouts there. They injected too much money in, which added to inflation. But you could argue that by opening the border, being laxer on the border, has kept down wages costs relative to what would have otherwise been the case. Of course, ordinary American workers don't like that mix. Higher inflation and lower wages. But as an economist, you might say, well, the two offset each other in terms of the overall inflationary impact. But it's certainly an interesting time.
And there's still a few more months to go, so I'm sure there'll be some other interesting events over that 4-month period. But if we think about the general trends in politics, we've seen the rise of populism across the world now for a number of years. In the past few months, we've seen even more of that with the elections in Europe and now with the US election in November. So what is a populist party? How do you really define that? And what are the long-term impacts of the rise of these populist groups on both the economy and on markets?
Well, if you look in the dictionary, a populist is someone who appeals or claims to appeal to the masses, to the ordinary person, against elites. And you could argue that a Le Pen, Nigel Farage in the UK, Trump in the US is doing that. You appeal against the masses. You're saying, I'm with you. We need to do these sorts of things. People like Joe Biden represent the elites and they've been working against us. And so we have seen movements in the past like this. Some would point to the 1930s. When it happened, when we had a depression in the US and globally, backlash against that in Europe, which in parts turned to fascism, Italy and Germany. Many, of course, went the other way and went to the left and said, look how well the Soviet Union's doing through the 1930s. It was a fantastic time for the Soviet Union, which was industrializing at that time. And so there was a movement which was swinging more towards government intervention. Obviously, fascism was an extreme version of that, and that didn't end too well for fascist countries. But right through the post-war period, I think governments in Western countries had to do everything they can to avoid going back to the 1930s. And that meant focus on keeping unemployment down, bigger government, industrial policies designed to build up auto industries in Australia, protectionism, all those sorts of things. Now, some would then say, well, that just set us up for bad times in the 1970s, stagflation and so on. And then you had the reaction going the other way and popular support for Reaganomics, Thatcherism, Hawke and Keating in Australia, deregulation, smaller government, lower marginal tax rates, and it all went back the other way. Now, for investors, that was actually fantastic news because it ushered in great share market returns through the 80s and 90s after the terrible times we had in the 1970s on the back of stagflation. But you could argue now we're seeing a backlash against that, those what you call economic rationalist policies or neoliberalism, backlash against smaller government, desire on both part of the right and the left whether it's Le Pen, the far left in France, or even if you listen to J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance strikes me as an old-time socialist, given all his comments about protecting workers, boosting wages, building more factories. Is the government going to do all this sort of stuff? Ronald Reagan would be turning his grave hearing this at the Republican convention. So that suggests, on the one hand, you're going to see more industrial policies. We're seeing a little bit of that in Australia with Future Made in Australia, but it's dwarfed by what's going on in other countries. And more government intervention in economies.
But why has this happened in the past few years? Like, what have been the triggers that have allowed these groups to get a much larger share of votes?
I think it's a bunch of things, but the main ones have been a perception that income levels are stagnating, surge in the cost of living, and perceptions or the reality of rising inequality, made worse by poor housing affordability. And it's interesting to note that J.D. Vance referred to some of those things, particularly housing affordability, that it's harder for the little person to get ahead, ordinary people to get ahead. So all those things, I think, have led to this backlash. It's been made worse in some countries by high immigration levels, obviously in the US and parts of Europe. So those things have added to it as well. But it's leading to this view that government needs to do more to protect workers, to create new jobs, to enhance wages and so on, and get us lower immigration levels. Now in Australia, I'm fairly optimistic that we have a good political system in the sense that democracy is compulsory in Australia, which is perverse in a way, but it does result in a lot of people who don't know saying, well, I don't really know, I'm just going to stick in the centre somewhere. They don't want to go to the extremes because they don't trust them. And then we've also got proportional voting, which means that it gravitates usually towards the middle somewhere. So that's a good thing, guards against extremism.
Although I guess we did have our own sort of groups with the Clive Palmer party doing a bit better, not maybe in the last election, but in the past few years, we had our own mini rise of populists.
Yeah, we have seen a bit of that. Pauline Hanson, One Nation, Clive Palmer's party on the left, you could argue, some would say the Greens, somewhat more populist. You know, they often used to be referred to as watermelons, green on the outside, red in the middle. I'm not taking a view on this. I'm just stating the perception that does exist out there. But in the great scheme of things, they've been kept on the margins. You know, they have an influence, but many of the far right or more right-wing groups haven't really got a lot of influence at all. Perhaps the Greens have got it come a little bit closer to it. But generally speaking, so I don't think we're going to have extreme government in Australia. We're not going to have anything like the Brothers of Italy in Australia or Trump makeover of the Liberals. Seems very unlikely to me. But nevertheless, governments here have had to respond. That's why we're seeing Future Made in Australia. We're seeing recently moves to restrict immigration levels. So that sort of populist push is still having an impact. I guess what worries me as an investor is that it was the policies of Reagan and Hawke and Keating and deregulation and smaller government which helped underpin the huge surge in share markets through the 80s and 90s. And you kind of worry this is going to be a lot more government intervention, allocating resources, that you could end up with a misallocation of resources, higher budget deficits, higher inflation, higher interest rates, and ultimately it could actually work against ordinary people, which is the problem with populists. They promise a lot and then they find it hard to deliver in terms of actual achievement. So that's what worries me a little bit. There are some things working in the opposite direction. Central banks these days are more adept at keeping inflation down. I know it got out of control the last little while, but on average, over time, they're more adept at doing that. Not all countries are going to the far right or the far left. Far right parties in Europe are only getting, they're still getting less than 50% of the vote. So there are some things where you don't want to get too negative on all of this. You just need to be aware that as we move into an environment where there's more government influence on the economy, it could ultimately act as a bit of a dampener on returns.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks, Shane, and see you next time.
Thanks, Diana. Take care.
For more info on Shane and Diana's podcasts and reports, head to the Insights Hub at amp.com.au.